Hello, everyone, and welcome to this live web event. My name is Chef Ken Rubin. I'm here with Chef Rick Moonen today. We are holding live chef office hours. So I know on some of the previous weeks, Chef Rick and I have done some Q&A related to the COVID-19 response. And today we are going to live on air answer all of your questions that we have coming in. So thank you for joining us. It looks like we already have a lot of questions streaming in. Great response here from our audience. Because we have such a diverse group of students and people really coming in from a lot of our different partners with these questions, we're going to have questions ranging from things that are just about basic cooking to some that might stray into the health and wellness space and other areas. So we're really excited to get to these questions. In some cases, I might take the question myself, and others I might pass to Chef Rick, and other times we might just kind of go back and forth about this. So again, if you have never asked a question on our platform, it's very simple. Directly to the right of where you see my face talking on the screen, there's an area where you can add question here. Click the black add button that puts it into a moderation queue that lets Patrick, our producer, have a quick look at it before we publish it. If you see a question that you like, there's a heart next to it on the list. Click on that. That will bump it up in the order of how quickly we can respond to it. So if it's something that you want to see answered quickly, just press that heart and we'll get to it a little bit faster. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and just jump right into these questions. Again, we really appreciate these. And if there's a question that's redundant or a question that we get multiple times, what we'll do is probably just answer it once and just refer back to the response on that question. So I'm going to go ahead and just take the first question here. And maybe this is one that Rick and I can even, kind of talk about a bit. But first question is from Bonnie. How do you know what spices and herbs should be mixed together for optimum flavor? So this is a question that we get quite a bit on Rouxbe about flavor combining, or what are those spice or flavor mixtures that become indicative of a certain flavor set or a certain type of cuisine even. But this whole question, I think, is really fascinating. Number one, first thing I'll say is the things that taste good to you might be pretty unique to you. So there's certain flavors that I know are universal or very, very well accepted as being things that taste good. And other things that might be more specific. So not all flavor combinations are going to be like, oh yeah, everyone likes that, but there are many where people go, oh my gosh, that's a common flavor set in a cuisine. If you think just as an example, I cook a lot of Latin American food, and Rick and I were just talking about Mexican cuisine right before we started the event. Think about some of the major flavor sets or the ingredients that will, when you put them together, will comprise Mexican cuisine, knowing that there's many cuisines within Mexico. But things like chilies and cumin or cilantro, coriander leaf, use of lime, the use of citrus and acid, all the different sorts of additional ingredients that help build flavors within that cuisine. Those are all things that really pair well together. So it's a matter of kind of looking towards cuisine, finding those foods that kind of like to dance or marry together, and then using that as a basis of kind of a jumping off point. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump into the next question now. I think Rick is just trying to get his audio here working. Next question that we have here is from Janet. How do you get everything ready and served hot? Planning a dinner or dinner party, and it seems food's always getting cold. Yeah, so Janet, good question. I think in these days of coronavirus, all of us would love to have a dinner party, even if the food was cold, maybe. But we're all become pretty accustomed just to cooking the foods in our home for our immediate families. But the question around planning is an important one. When I think about planning a dinner, even just my family dinners on a regular weeknight, I always think about the various components, the foods that will be resilient or forgiving or kind of easy to deal with, and other foods that are going to be more time sensitive or temperature sensitive, or things that you really say to yourself, oh no, I'm going to do it at the very last minute? Because if it's done 20 minutes or 30 minutes in, it's going to be a lot harder. So I would just say the biggest thing is just kind of planning out what that meal looks like, and then having the timing to make sense for that meal. So I always like to plan meals that have a combination of hot food and cold food, and then other things that you can have more forgiving. So more like room temperature or near room temperature salads and things like that. Rick, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, when it comes to putting together spices and herbs, etc., I mean, I think it's about if you're going to put together a savory entree or appetizer, doesn't matter. You know that parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme go well together. I mean, it's Scarborough Fair herbs is what I call them. And when it's Mexican, you know that you've got oregano and cumin and lime and cilantro and chiles. You know, those are natural. Coriander, coriander seeds, because you got cilantro as the plant and coriander seeds. All normal palate flavor spices and herbs being used in a Latino cuisine. And so, I mean, if you're doing hot, spicy, let's say Asian, okay, now pick a category. You can go from Thai, Chinese, Japanese, etc. You've got chilies, different types of chilies, Thai chilies, and you know that fish sauce goes well with that, even though that's not an herb, but it's a flavor enhancer and how everything interplays. So what I do when I'm challenged with this dish needs something, I'm not sure what it needs, I'll look in, because you've got the internet, check in on similar dishes and see what other historical spices and herbs are being used in a dish similar to what you're looking for. And it'll jog your, oh, that sounds like a good idea. I didn't even think of that. What you learn as a cuisinier over the years, as you're experimenting with new cuisines or new dishes that you haven't explored before, is about balance. And that balance is, to start off the basics, it's, salt, sweet, bitter, and what am I missing? Acid. So it's salt, sweet, bitter, acid. So now you taste a dish, and if it's just not in perfect balance, you need to consider which of those four categories is going to help enhance this. Because it need more salt. Salt opens up your palate, allows you to taste the natural flavors inherent in the ingredients that you're putting into your dish. So salt, although not a spice, is a door. It opens up. All the taste buds widen, and it's a receptor, and everything starts to becomes more clear. So, I mean, I think in the long run, the most important thing is that you just remain open, study different ethnicities, embrace the ones that are most in tune with your palate and what you like, because the amount of salt that I like to add may not be the amount of salt that you like to add, etc. But Ken, I'm going to put this back to you, because this is a conversation that can go on and on forever. I think it's more about experimentation and having at your fingertips, have all the colors, have all the palettes, have the entire spectrum of colors, have as many spices as you can at your fingertips. And I always recommend having whole spices and grinding your own, because that's how you're going to have more true flavors. Toasting of spices is really an interesting directive that you need to know. When do you toast a spice and when you don't toast a spice? It's about the ultimate flavor. When you toast a spice, it deepens, it makes it more earthy, it makes it richer. It definitely alters the flavor. Just think of a piece of white bread and eat it just as a piece of white bread, and then eat that same piece of white bread toasted. Totally different. Same thing happens with spices. So it's an never-ending, it's an ongoing conversation, Bonnie, and one that I enjoy playing with every single day that I play in the kitchen. But when it comes to herbs, I like to have dill around when it comes to seafood. Dill is just natural with seafood. Dill and lemon, beautiful together. Keep that in mind, you know. Dill, lemon, and thyme. So a little bit of thyme doesn't hurt. You know, Ken, I'm gonna put this right back in your hands and then let you take on the next question because I can go on for hours. Sorry.
Next question here we have from Carol. I find I spend a lot of time rinsing leafy greens. Is it necessary to rinse individual leaves or just the outer leaves of romaine or icebergs? Red leaf and kale seem to need individual rinsing. What is the best technique? So, it's a good question. I would say that the best thing to do is to absolutely rinse the entirety of all those greens, all the things that you're working with. The best thing to do is just to have a large plastic bin. I use like a Cambro, is like a restaurant food service supply type bin. A 6-quart or 8-quart container works perfectly fine. I'll use that and I'll take it and basically fill it full of cold water, break apart my lettuces or my kale, use that as my basis to kind of make sure that all those leaves are thoroughly washed. And then from there, I'll put it into some sort of a salad spinner. I have 2 different kinds, but essentially it's a basket that you can spin around and have some centrifugal force to help shed the water off those leaves. But I would say, to answer your question, 100%, you're going to want to make sure that your the entirety of the salad is being washed. You don't want to just do the outer leaves, because as those are growing, you could very well have a clump of dirt or sand or some insects or something even on the interior of that product. Next question from a person who says, I miss cheese. Is there a plant-based cheese that you like? Yeah, so we have a lot of plant-based students at our Ruby community. We do get the question a lot from a lot of our plant-based students about alternatives to dairy and looking at different types of products out there that mimic, the mouthfeel or the flavor that you might get from dairy. I would say, one of the big things, one of the most common types of, responses that I like to give about this has to do with just our very, very basic cashew cream sauce. It's not really cheese, more of a replacement for something akin to like a creamy sauce. So if you're interested in having like a creamy finish on a pasta sauce, or like a cream spinach that would normally use heavy cream or half and half, or some kind of a even sour cream, the cashew cream is an excellent substitute for something like that. So I'll do sometimes a creamy pasta with some cashew bechamel, cashew cream sauce, with the addition of plenty of lemon zest and some lemon juice, maybe some reduced white wine for acidity, and the inclusion of lots of herbs and lots of other great aromatics that make that delicious. In terms of other cheeses, I think that I've seen some really great applications using nut-based cheeses, things made from macadamia, nuts in particular. I've seen really good results, or pine nuts in some cases. Keep in mind that these are not really going to be melting or gooey or stringy at all like regular cheese, but will provide kind of a richness, a denseness, a certain type of a creamy character that you can use. All right, I got Rick back on audio here. Sounds good to me. Next question here, before we do a little bit more back to Rick, is what are the elements you need to think of when planning a satisfying dinner menu? Gosh, good question here. I would say, a dinner menu, like I was saying earlier, should really be a combination of things. So I always like to provide my guests, even just my family, believe it or not, a lot of different options. So there might be 3 or 4 or 5 things on the table. That way my kids, if they're feeling picky, can still have something to eat and something interesting for themselves. So I think about, the elements are going to be, what are those things that get people really excited? Those 100% wins that everyone's going to love at the table. The other night I had some bread that my mom had baked, actually. So she gave me some bread, at a distance, gave me some bread. And then I used that a few nights ago to make garlic bread. And I 100% knew my kids were going to go bonkers over the garlic bread because it's, fresh baked bread and fresh garlic and the whole thing. So you want to have at any meal those 100% wins, those things that are going to be a crowd pleaser. Then you want to have other things that are going to be interesting for people or noteworthy, things that maybe people haven't tried before or tried in a certain way, becomes a part of the conversation over dinner, or how did you do that? Why did you do it this way? These sorts of things. But they also like to use, the event of a dinner to pair things together, to say, hey, we have this amazing salad that we're producing. We've got 6 different possible toppings, and we're going to let you choose what that looks like or what the composition is of those sorts of things. So those are just a few thoughts there. I'd love to get Rick's thoughts on the elements needed when planning a satisfying dinner menu. Rick, any thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ken. First of all, I personally like to create a theme, and go as deep as you can in it. Like my wife and I right now during our quarantine days, hours, weeks, months, whatever it is, we like to challenge each other with that. So tonight, let's go Mexican. I know we're using that as an example a lot, perhaps, but what I like to do is choose a protein, choose a cooking method. Hey, I feel like firing up the barbecue. It's really nice outside. I'm in the mood to burn some wood tonight. So okay, what are we gonna cook on that? Oh, there's some salmon in the freezer. Let me slack that out tonight for tomorrow, and then I'll marinate it. And since we want to go on a Mexican theme, let me put together a little bit of a spice paste that I can rub on that salmon. I mean, this is what I'm giving you is a thought process. There is no straight answer, but you want to pick a protein, and then you want to kind of create the supporting actors of that dish or that experience. So I want it'd be easy to do a rice with this salmon, a little bit of rice, a little spicy red rice because it's Mexican, and perhaps I want to do a little bit instead of pasta. We already have a starch. Vegetable, starch, protein is really the trio of the building pillars of most dishes, and that's how. And I'm a boomer, so I come from a classical background, and that's sort of how I approach food still today, so that everybody's got that full rounded satisfaction. And just to make zucchini ribbons and just quickly cook those with a little bit of butter, and have some red rice and a salmon that's been rubbed with a paste and grilled on my over a wood burning grill. That's just, I'm giving you one quick example to give you an overview on how I like to approach the elements that plan a satisfying and fun dinner menu. And then when you have that, it's easy to pick, what do you want to drink with it? Do you want a margarita? Do you want to have a beer? Do you want to have a non-alcoholic? Do you want to have a vegetable? You get to choose how you want to go about it, but it's your theme, your dinner, and it's gonna be satisfying because it came from you. I'm gonna throw it back at you, Ken, because that's got to come from the heart. That's what cooking's all about.
Thank you, Rick. Great set of additional questions here. This one coming in from Kristen says, other than culinary education, what education variances do you think are helpful in creating plant-based business ideas? So we've got a lot of entrepreneurial type people, in particular with our plant-based courses. And I would say, the foundations, the underpinnings of cooking skills are obviously incredibly important for any business, and a plant-based business for sure. I would say in addition, when you think about that landscape around plant-based, there's a lot of intersections, I would say, between the environment, between health, between you know, working with various sort of, you know, areas that cross-pollinate, that create those points of meaning, those points of contact. So when I think about that, I think about what are those other business opportunities or channels of conversation that you could use to get people interested in what you're doing. So it could be that you're working in a health or a wellness type setting, and the messaging is not so much just about the cooking, but about the effects of the food on your health or on your wellness, how you feel. So I would say, you know, if you look at that, some of the education variances that might support in that context would be, you know, having some additional knowledge or background around nutrition specifically, or around health, or around, you know, community education or public health and these sorts of things. I would say that one big area we get a lot of questions around with plant-based would be people who want to eventually, you know, teach people, train people, provide cooking instruction of some sort. And I would say that the more that you're able to do that with a sense of comfort, with a sense of, I guess, lack of a better term, expert, you know, expert status, that's going to be really, really important for you to kind of be able to project that. And what we see with a lot of our plant-based students is they're by no means, you know, the end-all be-all expert on a subject, but compared to their peers or their family members, they might be the expert in the room, like the closest thing to a person who's read the books or done the research and that sort of a thing. So I would just say, you know, from that perspective, really leverage your talent, leverage your interest, leverage your skill. If it's an angle that's, again, maybe more health or more about the food production or more about the sharing or more about the design, those are all things that you can dig into.
I'm going to pick this one up. This is a question from Amy. Amy is asking a question. Please describe how you cook potatoes by boiling them prior to roasting. I will do this many times if I am trying to time, like if I'm cooking potatoes with other vegetables, for instance. I just did a dish the other day that incorporated a piece of chicken. All right. And I wanted to brown the chicken, remove it, and I added leeks, shallots, and garlic. And I wanted potatoes in there. But if I added potatoes along with them, by the time the potatoes were cooked, everything else would be overcooked. So I pre-cooked the potatoes before roasting them. So what I do is whenever you're cooking a potato, a starchy veg like that, I start off with cold water. I cover the potatoes in cold water, season them with some salt, and I bring them up together. That way the starches have a chance to cook properly. And I'll cook the potatoes until they're almost done, and then I'll finish by roasting or adding them to other vegetables and cooking them simultaneously. And I always season the potatoes when I'm cooking them because they need it. They need to have a little bit of salt. Again, let's never forget that our bodies need a certain level of salt in order to taste the flavor of the food. So that is how I interpret that question. I hope I've given you some help on your question. Ken, are you back? Yay. Well, let's continue. Let's continue then. Let's take a mercury ball test. I'm sorry, Jay, I'm not familiar with the mercury ball test. All right. Correlated chapter. Can you discuss how different methods of heat impact the overall nutrition of vegetables? I've heard mixed opinions about microwaving, but don't know enough about baking versus sauteing. Okay, so if it's about nutritional outcome of the vegetable, you're always best, in most cases, eating it as raw as possible. As you know, as close to picking it from the ground and putting it straight in your mouth is when you're going to get the most nutritional advantage of most vegetables. And I'm talking, of course, in a broad spectrum right now. So the quickest way that you can cook the vegetable is usually, to me, the best. And to cook it as undercooked as will make your dish successful. You know, I mean, nobody wants a crunchy potato undercooked. You want a potato that's cooked through. And potatoes, because they're starchy root vegetables, the nutritional value of theirs is not going to be cooked out. But when you're talking about a green leafy vegetable that has a more sensitive level of vitamin C, let's say, vitamin C can be cooked out fairly easily if you're not careful. So you want to cook that quickly and and season with salt. I'm sorry, I'm big on this, and as little as possible in order to maintain the nutritional value of the vegetable. And when it comes to microwaves, that's a long topic. Stay away from microwaves if you can, generally speaking, when it comes to nutrition, because I don't know if there's anything proven, but I just, from my own feeling, I think that you're better off going as paleo as possible when it comes to connecting the human body's need for nutrition and giving it the highest quality nutritional value from real foods is always. I always default to the method of the origin of cooking, and that's paleo. So Kenny, if you're back, I'd love to toss you back and get your input on that.
Wonderful. Yeah. Sorry about that. We're having just a little bit of instability in my audio here today. So I'm going to go ahead now and jump into some of these other questions. We have here a question about the Mercury ball test, which Rick was not familiar with. This is a Rouxbe video that we have where we show basically, how to heat a pan properly. And part of that is using this thing called a water test, which shows basically the water hovering on the surface of a very, very hot pan because of the amount of heat that the pan is giving off, and the water basically having this evaporative kind of nature to it where it's kind of hovering and floating above the pan. So the thing about the water test is it's really good for determining that your pan is hot. And by hot, I mean that it's going to mean that your surface of the pan is about 380 or more degrees. That's kind of the temperature range. So it's good because it tells you that your pan is basically good to cook with. Typically, you do this in a conventional kitchen to determine when your pan is ready to add your fat, right, your oil. In a forks over knives or no oil type context, that heat is still going to be the heat required to properly do a dry saute, or what they call a no oil saute, in terms of forks over knives. So the idea is that you are just essentially getting the pan hot enough so that those veggies don't immediately stick and more glide across the surface. What you want to do also with the dry saute is that once the food, depending on the starchiness and the sugar in the food, once it does begin to stick or even create some browning, because it will brown, is that you have a very, very small amount of water or flavorful stock, vegetable stock, a very small amount, meaning like a teaspoon or two, that you can flash on the pan and use that quick heat and that quick flash of steam to release the vegetables, to release those starches, to help bring up some of that color from the bottom of the pan. So the Mercury ball test is really that way to essentially help demonstrate that the pan is hot enough, so you're going to have a much better chance at better cooking results without the use of any oil. Next question here: how is nutritional yeast used in plant-based cooking? Also, what is it? What exactly is mace for? What does it do in baking? Most recipes says it's optional. So, nutritional yeast in plant-based cooking adds kind of a tanginess. People call it kind of a cheesiness flavor almost. So it's a depth. It has kind of a funky characteristic, like some cheeses smell, but ultimately it's kind of a tangy depth / sourness that you get from that nutritional yeast. So some people are more sensitive to it than others. I'm pretty sensitive to it in terms of the flavor. So for me, a little goes a long way. Other people I know just dump it in their food. They dump it on popcorn. They top it on top of a salad and things like that. I'm, like I said, more sensitive to it, so I tend to use less of it and get a lot of the benefits still, but without the volume that's required for some people. So using sauces, using toppings, those sorts of things. The other piece I would just say about mace is I would guess that you're looking at recipes that are kind of more sweet baking type recipes, where it might call for nutmeg or cinnamon and then mace. Mace is a great flavor combination. I would say it goes well not just in sweet applications, but also lots of savory applications. Mace is literally the exterior of the nutmeg that you would grind up. So it's this kind of strange looking, almost looks uh, like a brain or like some biological feature that kind of sits on top of the actual nutmeg. When that gets ground up, it has a similar flavor to nutmeg, but some other characteristics, kind of a spicier, less warm type of characteristic to it. So again, you can use it in a variety of foods. I happen to like it for certain types of pickling applications. It works really well, I think, offset with acid and then kind of rich flavors. It works well. Um, but yeah, it's one of those spices that I think oftentimes is set as optional or use it, in collaboration with some other spices. Next question. How can I develop confidence in the kitchen as a beginner? I've been struggling with some of the practical forks over knives course tasks as a result. Yeah, I mean, this is always the big challenge here. People who are interested in learning to cook start off kind of as a beginner and kind of just getting started, right? So the thing around cooking is it's not hard to do. People of all ages learn to cook. People can learn to cook in just a matter of days or weeks, but it's just a matter of practice and a matter of being very mindful and having the intent to learn certain things. So even though you're a beginner, there's certain things that I think you can work towards, and a matter of setting some goals for yourself and saying, you're not going to learn everything. You're not going to learn everything ever in terms of cooking. But if you want to spend a week or two and just, work on your knife skills with some vegetables, or work on how you handle, washing and handling green leafy vegetables. And just the more practice you get, literally touching and handling and working with those things, the more confidence you're going to have in doing it more quickly, doing it more confidence with maybe better accuracy, more precision, all those sorts of things. It just comes from doing it. It means making mistakes, finding your own best system that works for you in your home, and kind of keeping your brain turned on so that when you are processing food or cooking something, and you say to yourself, "Well, gosh, that took a lot longer than I thought," or "That went a lot faster than I thought," or "Gosh, I thought that would take me 30 minutes. It took me 2 hours." You can begin to learn from those things. Rick, I'd love to ask maybe you the question, not in the context of forks over knives necessarily, but in the context of just, I guess, building blocks or basic steps or building confidence. What are some of those things that in your career you've shared with people to help get them over the hump so they can realize the potential within themselves?
Well, thank you, Ken. First and foremost, you need to be patient, Marisha. Really, just give yourself the time that it's going to take to develop that confidence in the kitchen, and give yourself a set of references as you're learning. First of all, pick a task that you're pretty darn sure that you can accomplish with success. Because with success, and that's what's encouraging to take it to the next level. Without success, you lose interest. I mean, that's human nature. So taste in the very beginning when you start something. Taste the vegetable when it's raw. Taste the vegetable when it just starts to cook. Season it, then taste it. Taste it again when it's cooked halfway. Taste it when it's cooked three-quarters. Why? Because now you've got a set of references so that when you've accomplished success with that dish, now you've got a highway of points that you can check that you're on the right track. And with those experiences, you string them together, you gain more confidence, and you can take on more complicated tasks And it's always about repetition. And when it comes to cooking, you don't just nail it the first time, especially when you're a beginner. I've been cooking for 47 years, and there's times where I really have to take pause, reflect on what's going on in that pan right now, and evaluate it, taste it, utilize the set of references that I've gained over those years and tasted so many different times. Without those set of references, you will never be able to know how to rectify something that might be veering off course slightly. So confidence comes with repetition, comes with involvement. Taste it, smell it, get your face in it, smell it. And I can't emphasize the number of times that you taste something, even if it's a reduction for a sauce. Taste it when it's raw, and then taste it when it starts to come to a simmer. And then, because sometimes something will have a bitterness, and you're like, oh, this can't possibly be good. But eventually that bitterness boils off. It cooks away. If you're cooking with beer, holy smokes, beer can scare you because it's got bitterness. But there's so many different ways, and it goes through its own evolution as it reduces and cooks and caramelizes. And there's so many different variances in there. And I'm not saying these things to make you nervous. I'm trying to give you a little map to gain more confidence. And I'm going to go back to the first thing I said, and I'm going to give it back to you, Ken, and that is be patient. Have fun with it. Choose tests that you can have success with, and taste it. Always taste. Back to you, Ken.
That's great. I think, Rick, your comment around tasting it and getting in it, I think is very, very important. The idea that your senses and the connection that you have with your senses is going to help really inform your process, I think is 100% key. When I was running cooking schools and training people every day in that context, it was probably the number one thing I would tell someone was they would come to me and they would say, hey, chef, what do you think about this? And I would turn it right back to them and say, well, what do you think about it? Put your mouth on it. Give me your sense of the way it tastes, what the flavors are doing, what balance it has or doesn't have. And 9 times out of 10, the student would be able to essentially reframe the question by giving me information versus just asking me a question. So in other words, reframing it as, gosh, this seems really acidic. Is that the way it's supposed to be, or should I use something to balance it out? Or this is pretty aggressive on the garlic. What can I do to diminish the spiciness or the heat of the garlic? Is it a matter of time or some other ingredient that I could add, or a matter of process? Rick mentioned if you're cooking and you're reducing something, that's going to be very much different at the beginning of the process, where you might taste it and go, well, how could that possibly be good? And then you reduce it down by half or a third or 2/3 and go, wow, it completely changed the dynamic. I've got a much different acidity now, or a much different sense of balance, or some of those flavors matured or kind of came together. So love the answer about stick it in your mouth, taste it, let your body do some of that decision making for you, because you're going to have a reaction, you're going to have a response. It's going to make your face or your mouth pucker up, or it's going to make you smile or make you salivate or some other thing. Great question, though. Next question. What is the best way to cook flavorful food without saturated fat that comes from foods like coconuts? So I would say that, if you're looking at reducing saturated fat, and in particular saturated fat that comes from things like plant-based foods like coconuts, would be a big, type of oil that would have saturated fat, palm oil as well. Lots of plant-based fats have no saturated fat or very, very little saturated fat. So you might look to some of those if saturated fat is your issue. But also, there are styles of cooking that really diminish or use very little fat whatsoever at all, or oil whatsoever at oils. So there are other approaches to cooking, I think, that can help build flavor but aren't as fat dependent. I think going back to the earlier response about flavors and herbs and spices and building ingredients for a base of flavor is going to be more important and more probably relevant to the conversation about flavorful food than the inclusion of certain types of fats, categories of fats. So, go to quality produce, go to your herbs and spices, go to exciting vinegars and, things like that that can help build and add flavor versus those fats. That's probably a good first step. Next question here. I love fennel, but end up only using the bulb. What do you suggest I do with the stalks and fronds? I know I can freeze them, but then what's their use and value? Direct input would be appreciated. So, I would say it's a great question. I also probably tend to favor the fennel bulb over the stalks or the fronds. Although I have to say, like the stalks, if they're simply just cut up and put with the bulbs, if you're doing a braise or something like that, that works perfectly fine. I think the fronds, a little bit of a different situation. They have quite a strong pronounced flavor, of course, so I might add those fronds into a mixture with some other green herbs like maybe parsley and do kind of a fennel pesto of sorts. Also works well if you were to mix that with like carrot tops. Things like some nuts or seeds would go really well there. So I used to do like a fennel pistachio type of a pesto that I thought was really delicious. It had a bit of orange zest in it, which helped balance out some of the flavors. That's a great rub to put on vegetables that you're roasting, things like that. But Rick, I'd love to get your thoughts on the question of fennel, how to utilize the entire fennel versus just the bulb, which is the more typical part of the plant.
And well, okay. First and foremost, Lauren, I'm with you. I love fennel. It's one of my favorite flavors. It's probably because my dad, when we were growing up, he always loved licorice. So I learned at a young age that licorice meant love. But fennel, the bulb obviously is the best part. And I usually cut the bulb at the last possible minute because it's kind of light anise flavor. That anise, that anise flavor is fleeting. I don't like to pre-slice fennel bulbs and put them in water and soak them in water so they curl up and stuff, because then you take water that has the flavor of the fennel and you're throwing it away. But what I do with the stalks is I like to make stocks out of them. If you're making a vegetable stock, put them in your vegetable stock. If you're making a something with seafood, it's fantastic with seafood. If I have like fish bones and I have fennel stalks are automatically going to go in with my to make a fish fumet, it's called, or a fish stock. It's very quick to make and it's light. And even if you don't need it, you freeze it. So you don't freeze the stalks, because if you take them out, they're just going to be. To me, it's weird. When they're fresh is when they have more to give. You freeze them and slack them out or thaw them out, and they're not going to have a lot of flavor left. So cook them when they're fresh, infuse them into a liquid and freeze the liquid. And if you want them, you can. If I'm making a stock that has a lot of flavor, I freeze them in ice cube trays. And then I take the ice cubes out and I put them into a Ziploc bag, and now you got fennel stock. Just throw them in. If you have fennel fronds and they're fresh, or stalks, and you're grilling and you want to grill a piece of fish, throw the stalks down on top of the grill and put the fish on top of that and let the fish cook on top of the browning, burning stalks, and the flavor goes right into the fish and it comes out amazing. So other than that, I like to take the tops off and I'll use them instead of seaweed if I'm doing an oyster presentation. They look like fennel. They're beautiful garnishes. They got a nice flavor. They're a little maybe stemmy, but it's mostly the stalks that I like to use, and mostly in infusions and stocks and reductions. There you go. That's and you never have to throw out another piece of fennel again as long as you live, because even if you're not planning on using that stock today, it freezes well. So great question, Loren. I'm going to give it back to you, Ken, for the next questions.
Great. Thank you, Rick. Next question. Rick was just talking about the importance of salt enhancing flavors, etc. Due to blood pressure concerns, we try to avoid using salt in our cooking. Is there a good substitute? So, salinity is going to be certainly an important part of flavor building or enhancement. It's one of those kind of standard go-tos. I would say that on the whole, people who are trying to control salt, if you're not buying packaged or processed foods, um, the only salt that you're getting is from what you're adding to food. In those cases, you could really control or really limit your sodium intake. For people who are really, really trying to have no salt, I would say what's the sort of things you can use to build flavor, build interest, build palate appeal without having any salinity. And I would say there's probably two areas that I typically go towards. One would be herbs and spices. So really upping the overall, flavor components of a dish using those more powerful type things. So ground up herbs and spices, making sure they're really fresh, using fresh herbs to finish, those sorts of things. Just to, again, elevate the overall amount of flavor that you're getting in a dish. In some cases, you almost want to overcompensate with more of those types of things if you know you're not going to have any additional sodium. The second thing, in addition to herbs and spices to amplify flavor, I would say the thing that I go towards, just to support the salinity question, is probably acid. So the addition of finishing acids, vinegars, citrus, vinegar reductions, I think creates a little bit of that palate appeal, additional sort of salivation, opening up your palate. That salt might help provide. Of course, they're very different things, but I would say that those are the two that I would go to if you're on a very, very low or reduced salt type diet, to still keep food interesting, to keep your palate kind of guessing for the next thing, and to create a lot of variation within each bite that you have. So there are some comments there about salt. Another thing to consider with salt is a lot of people who are on very, very limited salt diets might prepare all their foods without salt during the cooking process, but might use what we call topical salt or finishing salt as a way to finish the dish. In other words, it's just the salt that sits right on the surface, meaning that your mouth gets a lot of impact from a very small amount of salt versus having salt throughout all the foods. That's just another approach to salt that you might consider. Next question, we use a microwave to cook our oatmeal every morning and to heat leftovers. Are nutrients preserved during microwave cooking? What are your thoughts on nutrition and safety aspects of using a microwave? Carol, like Rick, I think the jury's still out on microwave cooking. You read one study that says one thing about microwaves, diminishing certain qualities of food. You read another study that says microwaves do nothing bad to food. There's just no adverse reactions to microwaving as a food cooking, technology or method versus others. I would say that on the whole, I try to make my decisions based on what's going to be the best overall. So if I don't need to use a microwave, I'm typically not going to. I can find other ways to reheat food in most cases. I can find other and easy ways to make oatmeal or to boil, grains and things like that. So again, it's very personal. I would say it's up to you. Depending on the science and what you're reading, you can see a lot of different perspectives on this subject. Next question, when best to use many types of oils now on the market to make the price worth paying the higher price of some? There's grapeseed, avocado, coconut, extra virgin olive oil, canola. Another good question here, I would say, we have, again, within our Ruby community, a lot of different types of diets. Some people who do no oil or very, very little oil. Others who are eating a wider variety of foods. For myself, I tend to overall limit my oil consumption. It's not something I did when I was a working conventional chef for a long time, but I found that my health, my weight has been better in overall reduction of oils, I would say. When it does come to the oils that I personally choose to use, I go for refined avocado oil that has a high smoke point and extra virgin olive oil. Those are probably the two that I use the most when I decide to use oils for cooking. I think some of the other oils, again, you're going to need to make up your own decision, make up your mind about some of these things. But some of these other oils might be refined using some alternative methods that you may or may not be fully comfortable with in terms of the extraction process. Others are going to be, basically a lot more truer to form in terms of how they're processed or what the pressing or the processing of the oil actually looks like. So I would just encourage you to kind of do your homework, see the kinds of oils that are going to work well for you, how they're particularly processed. Within each oil category, say olive oil even, there's going to be huge variety of approaches for mechanically processing or chemically processing and extracting those oils. So just a matter of kind of doing your homework. Typically with some of these products, if there's more care taken or less volume in the production, they're going to be, there might be some higher costs associated with that. Next question, I'm going to answer this and then also pass to Rick here. What is the purpose of covering and uncovering a pot when making soup? If soup calls for an onion, what difference does it make if I use half an onion? So I would say the covering and uncovering of a soup pot, it's going to just help with your temperature control. Oftentimes when you're making a soup, you want to maintain a simmer, not a hard boil. It's going to affect the texture of the soup, the clarity of the soup, the overall appeal of the final product. I would say when it comes to, something like an onion or half an onion, onions come in all shapes and sizes. They can be really large. Onion can be 1.5 pounds. An onion can also be really small. It could be just a few ounces. So half an onion, whole onion, I think it's just more a matter of how much onion really is that by weight or by volume versus just by count. So if the recipe calls for a large onion and you don't have a large onion, you might need to use 2 medium onions. If it calls for half a large onion, then maybe 1 medium onion is perfectly acceptable in that case. So I would be less hung up on the quantity, more hung up on the flavor that you get from it. So if the recipe calls for 1 onion, you use half an onion, again, knowing that that can mean different things, and you don't use the whole onion, you're going to have less flavor in your food. So it's just sort of logical that if you have less of the thing that adds the flavor in your food, you're going to have less opportunity for it to taste a certain way. So if it calls for an onion, add an onion. If you don't like onion, you can reduce that, but certainly there'll be a lot less flavor if you keep reducing it down. Would love to get your perspective on that, though, Rick, in terms of some of these things around flavor in, flavor out in
food. Well, as far as covering a pot when making a soup, first of all, you have to, what is the end result? What are you trying to accomplish at the end of your soup? If it's going to be a beautiful white puree, you don't want any coloring. You don't want caramelization. You don't want to have little dark spots in your soup. You want it to be nice and clean. Then you're going to cover it because you're sweating it. You're allowing the steam that builds up within it to stay inside, and it all just reconstitutes and reconcentrates. It's kind of like distilling. The moisture goes to the top of the pot, it comes right back in. So you're losing nothing. So nothing's evaporating when you have a cover on it, and nothing is very little is coloring as long as you're controlling, the flame, the heat source. I mean, you can't have an extremely high heat source even with a cover on it. You're going to have caramelization and browning. So if your end result is a nice white fennel soup, and you want to sweat out that fennel with some shallots and and a little olive oil, maybe some butter or whatever you're using, and you want to cook it slowly, you're going to get the cleanest fennel flavor. And I would, going back to fennel, I'd take some toasted fennel seeds in a maybe a piece of cheesecloth in there while I'm sweating it all out. Now you've got clean, pure fennel flavor. And you add your stock or water, and then you bring it to a simmer. And if you had potatoes to thicken it with at that point, then you can choose to uncover it because you might want some of that liquid to concentrate. But if you want to maintain the flavor that you have, you cover it. So covering and uncovering a soup is oftentimes a mechanism to retain and get the color that you're looking for in the end, and the flavor that you want in the end, and the texture. See, so if you want it to be thicker, you want to add more to it, you want evaporation, you take the top off. So that is the purpose, from my perspective, of covering and or uncovering the pot in order to make soup. And as far as it comes, it's so funny when you read recipes and it says add 1 onion. An onion could be the size of a watermelon, and it could be the size of a marble. So I mean, it really should be by weight, but not many people cook with scales when it comes to putting together a soup. So an onion's an onion, and I look at it like, if I don't have a white onion and I have a red onion, and it's not going to mess up the color of the end of the soup, I'll use a red onion instead of a white onion, or a Vidalia instead of a yellow. It's not going to change the end result so drastically that it's going to mess up the recipe. You want to follow recipes, especially if you're just learning, because you want to give yourself a set of references, and that's when you can get creative later down the road. But Blanca, which means white, cover if you want it to stay clean colored, uncover if you want caramelization or depth of flavor or some sort of coloration of the soup. And if it's a simple flavor that you're working with, say for instance butternut squash, I like to sweat that out real slow. I put butternut squash in with a little bit of onion and some butter into a pot, and I'll cover it, sweat that out with a pinch of salt. It's a long period of time. You get the most sweetest caramelized flavor from that butternut squash, rather than just cooking it real quick. And you learn this stuff by experience, and paying attention. So, Ken, back to you with the next question.
Great, thank you, Rick. Next question here from Jacqueline. I tried putting scraps from veggies in a freezer bag, and when full made stock, it turned out to be really bitter. What do you think the reason for that? Could be that the proportionality of the vegetables that you had in there just didn't make for a good stock. So because you're depending on, the scraps that you have versus the kind of more standard ratios or proportionality that you'd want to use in a stock, my recommendation is always use those things from the freezer, but always supplement it with the fresh whole vegetables that you're going to want to make that stock proper. So even though I keep a freezer bag and it's got ends of carrots and ends of celery and pieces of shallot or whatever else in there, I always look at that bag and go, great, I know I need 2 big onions, a few carrots, some bay leaves, some other things in that stock to balance it out, and not just to be beholden by what's in the bag. I also make a lot of stock, so I'm always kind of aware that in my freezer at any given time I have one set of things more than the other. So I'm always trying to kind of balance out those things. So that's my best guess for what happened, was you just didn't have a good balance, and we're probably lacking some of the things that add sweetness, which could be things like parsnips or carrots and things like that. Next question here. Given the popularity of carry out and delivery, what seafood dishes are best for such circumstances? Thank you. Chef Rick, I'm going to have you answer that question.
Okay. Seafood. Why wouldn't I? I've had a little bit of experience with seafood. Carry out. Okay. So as a seafood chef for many, many years, putting my creation in a carry out container and sending it off and hoping for the best result for the guest who gets the recipient of it, I won't choose a item that will dry out, overcook, and so you want something that has natural fats, like a scallop, for instance, a sea scallop. It's got beautiful fat, or a piece of salmon, or swordfish, or sea bass, or something that has the fattiness that's going to maintain the integrity of that seafood item. Those are the items that will probably travel best and show up in a condition that is the way you intended it to be. Other ways of doing it are cooking them in a sauce, like a tomato-based sauce, for instance, such as a Diablo, like a Fra Diavolo, or a Cioppino, or a soup, or something that has a broth to it. That's going to also help to maintain the integrity and the flavor and the nutrition of the seafood items that are comprising the dishes that are being picked up for, table carry out or curbside pickup, etc. Things that I would avoid would be like a fillet of like red snapper that's just been sautéed and put on top of a salad, because that tends to get, it just dries out. It's hard to keep, so that you're maintaining its texture on your palate. And to go back a question or two, when it comes to oils, grapeseed oil. I like to use grapeseed oil a lot when I'm creating a vinaigrette that I want to pull from the refrigerator and use immediately, because it doesn't solidify when it gets refrigerated. And flaxseed oil as well. You make a vinaigrette using flaxseed oil. You can just take it out, shake it up, and use it. If you use extra virgin olive oil, it's going to come out and it's going to be thick, because extra virgin olive oil, it changes its texture. And the reason I bring this up in discussing the seafood dish is because the oils that you choose in making a sauce are going to also vary. Like if you're using butter, if you put butter in the refrigerator, it's going to solidify. Use extra virgin olive oil in the refrigerator, it's going to solidify. So the type of oil that you use to finish a seafood dish, depending on the temperature that you're planning on eating it, such as if you're going to eat it cold, like a ceviche, you don't want extra virgin olive oil in a ceviche unless you're pouring it in last minute and serving it. But in a pickup and re-thermalization or temperature control, these things need to be taken into consideration when considering what you're going to purchase from a restaurant, or if you're a provider, what you want to use to put into your dish to have the best end result for the guest. So I hope that gives you some insight, Robert. Back to you, Ken.
Excellent. We have just a few more questions here that we want to make sure we can get through. So next question here, I use a little bit of agave syrup as a sweetener in my coffee. What are your thoughts about the comparative nutritional value of agave or honey in sweetening coffee or baking? Now, I'd say when it comes to something like agave or honey, these are just sweeteners. They're not going to really carry nutritional value. They're high in calories. They're basically, in the case of both agave and honey, a combination of fructose and glucose. So, there's not really nutritional value that you're getting from it in terms of, micronutrients. It's a lot of macronutrients, a lot of sugar, carbohydrates, simple sugar in this case. So I wouldn't count on those things to provide nutritional value. It's really just serving that function of being sweet. Next question. I am in the middle of the sauteing pan tossing task. Why? Ruby suggests 1 tablespoon non-dairy butter and 1 tablespoon oil. Why the mix just instead of 2 tablespoons of one? So sometimes when you're doing sauteing, you might have a mix of butter and oil just for coloration and for smoke point reasons. So the non-dairy butter is going to have a lower smoke point than something like a refined oil, like a peanut oil or a grapeseed oil. So the variation there is just based on the smoke point. Which of these are the best substitutes for kombu? Wakame, arame, or dulse? These are the only items I have in my pantry. So I would say, for kombu, gosh, they're all going to be a little bit different. The kombu's adding, less of a strong direct seaweed flavor. It's used differently, especially when you're using it kind of start a seafood stock or a mushroom stock or a miso stock or something like that. The arame I would say is going to be somewhat close. The wakame and the dulse I think are going to be just too assertive in terms of the seaweed flavor. But any of them, if you just use a small amount, might get you to where you want to be. But the kombu is going to be just a little different in terms of the overall flavor and the penetration of flavor compared to some of those other seaweeds. Next question, I'd like to better understand how to build a menu for a dinner party. I often know what I want for a starter or for a main course, but don't know what would go well with it. Any help would be appreciated. I think that the short answer to this is just, what would you want to have on a menu? What are those things that if you were going out to eat or at a friend's house, and you were presented with some options, what are the things that would be pleasing to you? So sometimes it's, hey, what would be great with that main course is two side salads. You want to do a bean salad and a leafy green salad. Well, fabulous. Or you want to do a hot dish and a cold dish. Well, fabulous. So I think it's sometimes a matter of, maybe not having the rule and just having the ability to say, well, what would be pleasing based on what I have and what time I have and who I'm serving, those sorts of things. Next question, I want to learn updated cooking techniques. Can you tell me some updated cooking techniques? So I think what we're getting into here are maybe some techniques around things like low temperature cooking. Sous vide would be one of those types of approaches that use or leverage low temperature techniques. I would also say another technique would be fermentation. These are not new techniques. These are actually old techniques, but these are techniques that are constantly being updated for the new professional kitchen in terms of applications, in terms of ways of envisioning things on certain menus. Rick, I'd love to get your take. I know we just had a conversation recently about fermentation. What are some of the techniques that you think are maybe not new, but more novel that people can play with or experiment with these days?
Well, first of all, Ken, I completely agree with you. I'm an old school chef. I was classically trained, so everything that sous vide is completely a new technique. Even though it's been around, you really can't use it all that much in restaurants because there's a lot of restrictions, and depending on where your market is and what the health code regulations are within that market, it has parameters that are put into place because of the the understanding of no oxygen or low oxygen cooking is not a complete science, but that should not slow you down from experimentation of cooking with in sous vide. Because using of a thermal circulator or a super accurate low temperature controlling device, it's amazing what you can have as a result. I mean, I just recently cooked a piece of bison, because I'm trying to get away from the three proteins, the pork, beef, and chicken. So I bought a culotte of bison, and I marinated it in sous vide, real quickly. I put rosemary, garlic, allspice, and some juniper berry. Okay, salt, pepper, and garlic. Sealed it, and I cooked it for 7 hours in sous vide at 129.2 degrees Fahrenheit and seared it. It was incredible, unbelievable. I mean, and I've been cooking for many years, and to get that kind of a result and that kind of control, it blows my mind. And it's like 7 hours, of course. So sous vide, play around with it, read up on it, and it just opens a whole nother world of results and consistencies. I am at this moment of my life, because I have extra time on my hands, learning a lot more about fermentation. I'm making a kombucha because I enjoy it, and I like to see things alive in my home. I'm gonna start experimenting with koji, which and utilize that to put on the outside of certain proteins to see how it affects the protein that I'm marinating it in. And that's something that's brand new to me. As I answer this question, it's that's my personal new experimentation with myself. And we have time during this pandemic, and so go online, get involved. There's plenty of information on Rouxbe. As a student of Rouxbe, there's a lot of information available to you all as well. This opens up many different avenues of experimentation. And there's always the area of umami that just it completely intrigues me to no end, and finding new sources of umami. And how I describe umami is the uncontrollable salivation. You taste something, and all of a sudden your mouth just starts to go crazy. And that's what fermentation and certain ingredients bring to the table. So all of that is new technique, and anyway, nothing is really new. It's all been done before. It's just a lot more controllable today with things like thermal circulators. So I'm going to throw it back to you, Ken, to wrap it up, my friend.
Right. Thank you, Rick. We've got a lot more questions here that I'm going to go through somewhat quickly. So next question, after reviewing posted refrigerator makeovers, I feel overwhelmed. During the coronavirus, we've stocked up on standard American diet items in our fridge. Notice the posted comments mentioning you've been following the vegan diet. So yeah, Sherry, just do your best. Obviously, if you're in the Forks Over Knives course and you're posting those pictures, we just want to see that you've made an effort. But obviously, everyone's in a unique situation, so just do your best with what you have. Next question has to do with ciabatta recipes. Why do ciabatta recipes call to hold back on a small amount of water from the initial mixing of flour and water and adding only after majority of water and flour is mixed? Why can't you add them all at once? Well, lots of bread recipes want you to really check the hydration, get you get your dough to a point where it mixes really well, it's really loose. And if it's too loose, you might need to add more flour. If it's not loose enough, not hydrated enough, adding more liquid in there. So that's my guess in terms of the recipe that you're seeing. Next question from Sherry. I noticed people having diet cheese in their fridge. I'm guessing it's not part of a whole food plant-based diet, right? Yeah, so that's not part of a whole food plant-based diet, but if that's what you want to have in your fridge, that's okay. Also, can one make fruit preserves as a whole food plant-based diet? Yes, you sure can. So just don't have any included refined sugars in those preserves. So just basically cook down fruit and pectin would work perfectly fine. When I experiment with cooking Mexican food, I often find the chili sauce to be too harsh tasting, not too spicy, but very hot. What ingredient will tone the sauce down? So I would say, maybe finding something to add some small amount of sweetness to that, and maybe even a small amount of acidity might help with that. Otherwise, it just might be that you need to simmer that sauce for longer, tone it down a bit, let those flavors marry and mingle a bit longer, and that might be your best bet there. Next question here. I'm a graduating high school senior who has been working in the food service industry when I was 13 and wants to become a camp, retreat, conference center chef, food service director. What is my best, most economical education route? I would say that there's going to be a lot of ways that you can learn. Certainly Rouxbe is going to be one of them. I'd say the most important thing for you is really honing your skills to work specifically in that segment that you want to work in. So there's going to be certain skills, certain dispositions that you're going to need to work in that environment versus other environments. And those are going to be the ones that you're going to want to hone in on specifically for that aspiration or that job goal that you have. All right. We're going to now pass on to Rick to see if he can answer just a series of more questions. We've got a lot more coming in here.
Certainly. Thank you. Hey, Julie, when it comes to the harshness and balancing the flavors of your sauces, chili sauce in particular, I do know what you mean. Sometimes you can end up with a bitterness. Many chili sauces start off by toasting the chili, and you can pick up some bitterness. You can pick up some bitterness from that. At the very end, usually you're looking for the most balance. And the two ingredients that I like to play around with to balance a chili sauce is apple cider vinegar and agave syrup. You play around with those two. The sweet and acid are the two things that are going to bring it into a place where that harshness will diminish, or it will integrate itself into a much more balanced flavor when you're done. So those are my little secret adjusters. It's apple cider vinegar, and which is not necessarily a Mexican ingredient, but I find that it works incredibly well in chilies sauces, and as well as agave, which is certainly a lot more affiliated and associated with chili sauce recipes. Do you want me to roll to the next question? Why not? Why don't I? Kathleen, how can I get my souffle to rise above the Ramekin? Do I need to dust the Ramekin with a finer sugar? I use organic now. Should I be more generous when I butter the ramekin. Absolutely, you can't be too generous when you're adding the lubrication to get a souffle to do its magic and to end up above the rim. Absolutely, make sure that you've got your butter even all around and completely coated, and fill it with sugar and roll it all the way to the tip, and then just knock it out lightly with your hand. And usually that's enough to prepare your ramekin for a successful souffle. What impact, this is Shelley, what impact, if any, do you see with COVID crisis will have on our food trends? Well, my opinion is for restaurants to survive in the long run, we're going to have to figure out ways to bring some more profitability to the items, to the proteins that we're using. So I see some newer cuts and some newer proteins coming onto the menus of the future. And as far as, it's not going to be so much of fine dining, but just fine foods, which means flavors, ingredients that are put together in a manner that give the palate the flavor party that it's looking for, but not necessarily utilizing the lobster tail, the Wagyu cut of meat, etc., because it's just not, the profitability is going to be just washed right out of that, and the industry has already been operating on a very low profitability percentage to begin with. So I think food is going to evolve into a more comfort food, protein choice, but I think the elevation and the talent of the chef, the knowledge of the chef, the way they handle that protein is what's going to set the next food trend of the future. And that's just my opinion. Ken, what do you feel?
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think that people with coronavirus and COVID, I think this is going to definitely change people's sense of comfort with food. Definitely also change people's sense of how much time they want to commit to food and cooking and eating. In some cases, they'll want to commit more because they have the time. In other cases, they're just looking for the fastest possible repetitive type approach. So I think that absolutely it's going to change the way we think about food, how we eat. And it's also, I think, too early to tell how this coronavirus is going to have long-term effects on the supply chain and the food chain more generally, which of course could help decide what we as consumers ultimately want to eat or do actually eat. So great commentary there. Next question here, just for the sake of time, we're going to go through some of these fairly quickly, but can you provide some tips to someone learning to sharpen their own knives? I know you have lessons on this, just finding it difficult to learn. Melina, I would just say practice is the big thing. So that's going to be a common trend today. I would say that you need to practice sharpening your knives on a sharpening stone. If it's something you're not comfortable with, you can obviously send those off to a service and they can do it for you. And then you can get more comfortable with the honing or using the sharpening steel, that part of that process. But otherwise, I would say just it's a matter of either using a electric sharpener and doing the pass-through method, or using a stone and becoming comfortable with that motion back and forth on that blade. Next question, what do you consider to be your top pantry staples? I would say for me, the running joke here around Rouxbe is that I've got a lot of lentils. I would say lentils are probably my top pantry staple for myself. I've got a lot of pantry items, but lentils, different types of rice and different types of beans, I would say are my top ones. Next question here. I'm not a fan of brewer's yeast. It tends to be in most nut-based cheeses. What role does brewer's yeast play in these recipes? Is it flavor? So Jerry, I don't see brewer's yeast in nut-based cheeses. I see a lot of nutritional yeast used in those contexts. Brewer's yeast I see in some applications, but mostly in baking applications or in brewing applications, because the flavor is so different. Brewer's yeast, to me, has a very strong underlying bitterness, whereas nutritional yeast, like I explained before, has kind of a tangy, cheesy type flavor, and that's where you see it in a lot of nut-based cheeses. Next question, where might I find lion's mane mushrooms, king oyster, interested in trying the grilling substitution. So, I would just say you're going to have to probably look online, maybe mail order those now through a specialty store. But typically you can buy those at higher end type markets. Sometimes Asian markets will have those as well. Please compare the different types of eggs and why to use one or the other. Omega-3, brown, regular, free range, etc. This is a huge topic. I can't really get into it now, but Rouxbe just launched a course called Egg Pro. So if you wanted to go to eggpro.rouxbe.com, there are some new courses available on Rouxbe actually right now for free if you want to learn all about different types of eggs, how they're produced, those sorts of things. Is there a way to make traditional holiday foods such as matzo balls without eggs and oil? So yeah, I've done egg and oil-free matzo balls. They don't have quite the same texture or flavor, of course, but I've used flax meal to help with the binding. And I've used a little bit of cashew, pureed cashew butter, essentially, to help with some of the richness in there. The thing that I did do is I upped my nutmeg and my black pepper and added some additional onion powder into my matzo balls and let them sit for even longer before I tried to boil them. So also made them smaller. All those things tended to work pretty well. Should vegetables be steamed over the stove or use an actual food steamer? There's lots of different ways to steam. You could use a steaming basket. You can use an insert. You can use a bamboo steamer. So as long as you're steaming, there's a lot of different modes of steaming. Patrick just put the URL to the egg course on there. Thank you. My kitchen has an electric stove top, which makes it difficult to control temperature. Starts off okay, then becomes too hot. What do you suggest short of getting a gas stove? So, Sherry, just knowing how your stove behaves. So you already gave me good information that it starts off fine and then gets too hot. So you might just start it off less hot, knowing that eventually you'll get to the proper temperature. So just back down on the temperature, on the heat, before you get there, meaning don't overheat. Start slower, go slower, increase to where you want to be. But absolutely a problem there. All right, Rick, let's have you come back into some of these questions here, Rick.
Sure. There's no straight answer of how to control your stove, but you don't always have to have the pot directly in the center of the heat source. Sometimes you can move the pot off to the side a little bit as well, and help control. Because sometimes devices, or especially electrical heating sources, tend to be sensitive, and because you're cooking there, and if you're cooking there a lot, sometimes it gets gummed up, or something may happen internally that you're not even sure of. And short of taking apart your own stove, not many people will do so. Just move the pot around a little bit. You're in charge. So that I just wanted to throw that in as a suggestion, because sometimes when I'm in an environment where I'm not familiar and I have to cook my way through whatever I'm cooking, I find myself doing all kinds of adjustments to get the heat exactly to do what I intended to. So, you want me to continue with the questions, Ken? All right, I will. All right. Hello, this is from Steven. I am semi-retired and thinking of doing a small business idea with a whole food plant-based soups and perhaps some meal prep ideas. I've taken the 3-month whole food plant-based cooking course. Steve, I'm going to give that to you, Ken, because you're a better expert answering that question than I am.
Yeah, I would say, Stephen, some of the things you can think about with that sort of a business really would be what's your audience. So right now, I think that you got to take extra time and attention on who's the audience, who's going to want to receive that food. Things like soup make a lot of sense these days because people can reheat that and feel a lot of confidence. But I think it's a great concept, Stephen, something that you're going to want to pursue. Certainly, if you can make a small business out of it, even better. Next question, we must consume a diet that is gluten-free. My partner also cannot consume corn, soy, dairy. I'd love to make him sourdough and other gluten-free breads, but I believe this will be difficult. Can you offer some tips, please? Yeah, so sourdough wouldn't be gluten-free because it starts using soured dough, which is going to contain gluten. So I would really look towards other types of breads that probably don't resemble these big loaf breads if you're looking for something that's going to be gluten-free, fully. So things like flatbreads, tortillas, quick breads might just be a better category for you to look at in that gluten-free space. Those are just some suggestions there. How many kind of main food allergies? I'm not sure, Lang, exactly what you're asking there, but there are lots of different categories of food allergies. Big ones include things like corn, gluten, dairy, eggs, and so on. A lot of common foods are also foods that people tend to have allergies towards. Next question. I teach cooking classes to children. When it was in person, it was easy to sign students up to attend my classes. Now that classes are virtual, I'm finding it very difficult for anyone to find me in the virtual world. Any tips? Yeah, Lisa, I think it just comes down to your audience and your network. So start small, maybe just with a few people online. Use those people to create really exceptional experiences for them, and then drive more experiences for yourself with word of mouth through those people. So it's going to be really tough. You're not going to come up on the search engines. You're not going to want to pay money to come back and search results and those sorts of things. So I would take it very much as a grassroots type effort. Look to your immediate circle of friends and family, your immediate network, to be the people to become the audience for those classes, I think, at least for now. Next question. Which part of chicken is used in hot and sour soup? How to make chicken so tender and juicy? So I would guess that that's going to be any parts of the chicken, Adiba. It's really a matter of having the right base of the soup to start with, and then probably some sort of a shredded chicken to go into that soup. When I get the recipe content for developing the menu, how do I make quality food presentation? What is a consideration for food presentation? Yeah, it's a very big question. 3 big questions in there. I would say that presentation is going to be super important for the visual appeal of food, to get people to feel excited by it. The colors, the flavors, the way it's presented on a plate, going to be really, really key for you. Part of developing your own style, I would say, as a cook, is finding the types of presentation that you like to use on the plate to get people excited about the food. But there's all kinds of resources out there if you're interested in plate presentation and the way food looks. I tend to get some inspiration and ideas by going online and following people who are on Instagram or other sorts of social media type people who do a lot of artistic work on plating. Not always something that I would do personally, but always great to get ideas from people. Are there any resources, ebooks, websites that you can read which add more detail to the material covered throughout the course? I'm not sure exactly what course you're in. So if you want to contact our customer service team, let them know what specific course you're in. They might be able to help provide some additional resources. Many of our courses do come with a resource guide at the end, or resources included in the sidebars of each task. How long can we safely use commercially prepared garlic infused oil once opened? Commercially produced garlic oil is going to be fine. There is a botulism concern with homemade infused garlic oil because of the botulinum toxin specifically. But if it's commercially made, I would say just use it according to the package recommendations. I love Ruby's pan sauces. How is the best way to double the recipe? Should I add gelatin to 2 cups of stock? No, Kathleen, I would say to double the recipe, just simply take the ingredients that you see listed in the recipe and simply multiply it by 2. So if it calls for 1 cup, make it 2 cups. If it calls for 1 quart, make it 2 quarts. You're going to have slightly different times in terms of preparation because, of course, the more volume, the reduction, let's say, of a sauce, or the simmering of a sauce to reduce it, it's just going to take longer time. Can you recommend resources for plant-based recipes? Jennifer, I use the internet. There are gazillions of resources out there. I'm not specific to any of them. I would say I probably look at 30 to 50 different sources every week. So I would say for you, it's just a matter of finding the sorts of things you like to cook, the personalities or the bloggers or the sites that kind of jive with your approach to cooking, and use those. I'm not at all I never feel beholden to those types of things. I always just kind of use them and then move on, sort of an approach. After viewing posted refrigerator makeovers, I feel overwhelmed. Oh, looks like we already had this question. So yeah, just don't feel overwhelmed. Do the best you can. Clean out your refrigerator if you're in that forks over knives activity. Just do the best you can on that, Sherry. Can you explain why some resources refer to four pigments of or four pigment categories of vegetables, flavonoids, anthocyanin, chlorophyll, and carotene instead of three covered in the course: chlorophyll, carotene, flavonoid? So anthocyanins are actually, to me, a type of flavonoid. They're just a white or light colored flavonoid. So they actually kind of operate in very similar ways, but that's an interesting distinction. So thanks for pointing that out. Next question, I'm going to pass to Rick for an answer. What is the best way to freeze fish?
Okay, well, it depends what fish, of course. I'm going to be freezing some salmon today, for instance, and I like to put them into individual amounts that you're going to want to take out and thaw out. So, I mean, you don't want a whole side of fish if you only want to have a couple portions. So you portion it out. I like to put it in either Ziploc bags, or I have a sous vide machine. I will sous vide my fish to get out as much of the air as possible. And then I just put it in the coldest part of my freezer and do it as quickly as possible. I don't usually wrap it in paper. I like plastic over paper for sealing the air out of the bag. And if you're buying fish that is IQF, which means individually quick frozen, just again put it in Ziploc bags and keep it frozen. But if you're freezing it yourself, IQFing is not an easy process, so I wouldn't even consider it. Just put it in a Ziploc bag, squeeze out the air as you're closing it, or wrap it in plastic. Julie would be the best way.
Rick?
Ken, back
next Ken. Question that we have here. I'm currently waiting for several new stainless steel pans to be delivered that I purchased. Generally, do I need to do anything besides washing them before using? Meg, nope. Just wash them. Perfectly good. You don't need to season them or anything like it's a cast iron pan. So easy to use. Next question. I just purchased the Otis Professional Whipped Cream Dispenser. Are there any really good recipes that are dairy-free? Yeah, I mentioned earlier a cashew cream recipe. You can make that cashew cream sweet, not savory, and putting it into one of those pressurized canisters will produce a beautiful whipped-style dessert because of the pressurized nature of it. I just want to make sure that going in is very, very cold. But if you want to look online, you can see all kinds of non-dairy whipped desserts. Some of them have agar in them to add some body and some additional character. So you're essentially making a semi-fluid gel with the agar and whatever cream type replacement you're using from cashew cream or coconut cream and things like that. So there are tons and tons of options for you there. Looks like our last question of the day. What are all the seasonings you would recommend for plant-based food? Well, Darius, I can't get into all the seasonings I would use for plant-based food. It would be quite a long list, but I would say generally you're going to want to choose the things that taste good for you, foods that kind of represent your style or approach to eating, or things that are available to you. I eat across the board from around different cultures and different parts of the world, so my pantry and the flavors that I have in my home are pretty diverse. But there's certain parts of the world that I tend to visit from a culinary perspective more often than others. I spend a lot of time in the Middle East, a lot of time in Latin America, and those are the kinds of flavors I typically gravitate towards. So when you're looking at the seasonings that you want, it's just a matter of what's going to taste good for you. What do you like? I'm going to pass to Rick to use this as a way to say goodbye, but also help answer this last question from Darius. So Rick, what are your thoughts?
Oh, thank you, Ken. Seasonings, I completely concur with your answer, Ken, to be honest with you. But I've been finding myself when I look at answering my own questions, such as this, plant-based cuisines. What cuisines really do a fantastic job with plant-based dishes? And I go to India immediately in my mind, because some of the flavor combinations, how Agave and all of these type of flavors. So I find that the Indian spice palette is really interesting when it comes to plant-based foods. So play around with that, Darius, and enjoy your time with it. And if you don't have those spices, order them online, have them delivered to you, and just knock yourself out and have a good time. Ken, I just want to thank you for allowing me to participate in office hours today. It's a lot of fun to get some questions asked. There's no way to prepare for them. It's just really our way of sharing our experience, our knowledge, and our opinion with all of you, students or otherwise. And it's been a real pleasure to be a part of today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick, and just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. Sorry, went a little bit on overtime, 40 minutes over, had a lot of great questions. So thank you all again for joining us today. And until next time, we look forward to seeing you in class, and happy cooking. Take care.